Sign the ledger or say goodbye to your son. You flower-dusted nobody. I am Poppy, a 32-year-old bakery owner. For 5 years, I worked brutal 4 shifts, baking thousands of pastries for their religious charity. In one ruthless threat, they revealed my kitchen was just a money-laundering front, erasing my honest sacrifice. Keep baking, or you'll never see him again. My husband sneered. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I just traced my brass storage key, clutching the raw ingredient receipts proving their fraud, and dialed a monster I swore I had deleted. Before tonight's charity gala ends, the feds will freeze their stolen assets and haul them away in handcuffs in front of 400 elite donors. Let me show you how their empire crumbled. It is terrifying when the people you trust use your child as a weapon. Drop your city and time in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to the morning this nightmare began. I sat on an overturned flour bucket in the dim light of the bakery's back storage room. In my lap rested a thick stack of thermal receipts. $300 for a bulk order of organic vanilla bean. $700 for 50 bags of unbleached flour. For 5 years, I had believed I was building a secure life, giving them my best years while providing honest labor for Eleanor's so-called sacred charity. I thought my bone-deep exhaustion was simply the price of belonging to a respectable family, but the numbers on my husband's official tax ledger told a very different story. According to Thomas's filings, that $300 vanilla order cost $5,000. The flour was billed at $12,000. My quiet, anonymous little bakery was never a sanctuary. It was a washing machine for their stolen donor funds. The heavy steel door swung open, hitting the wall with a sharp clang. Thomas stood in the doorway, his custom Italian suit completely out of place against the dusty bags of sugar. He did not look at the flour on my apron or the exhaustion in my eyes. He just looked at his gold watch. The gala starts in 4 hours. Poppy, he said, his voice smooth and entirely hollow. I carefully slid the real receipts under a heavy wooden clipboard. I told you. I am not going, I said quietly. Not until you explain why my signature was forged on these vendor contracts. Thomas sighed, stepping into the cramped room. He did not yell. He just pulled out his phone, tapped a screen, and held it up for me to see. It was a live security feed of our living room. My 3-year-old son was sitting on the rug, playing with his wooden blocks. Standing directly behind him were 2 large men in dark security uniforms. My mother is taking him to the VIP suite at the hotel tonight, Thomas stated calmly. He will stay there. With them. You will put on the dress she bought you. You will smile at the elite donors. You will sign the final audit release. If you do anything to embarrass this family tonight, those men will take him on a very long vacation. He stepped backward into the hallway. Keep baking, or you'll never see him again. He pulled the heavy storage door shut. The exterior deadbolt slammed into place with a sickening thud. I was trapped. The air in the room grew incredibly thin. I did not scream. I did not beat my fists against the steel door. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. I stood up, walked to the main electrical box on the wall, and reached behind the metal panel. My fingers brushed against a small, hidden flash drive. It contained a digital copy of every real receipt, every true cost, and every forged signature they had forced upon me over the last 5 years. But evidence was entirely useless if I was dead. I reached into my apron pocket. My fingers traced the cold edges of my brass storage key, a key that could no longer open the door holding me in. My hands were perfectly steady. I pulled out my cell phone, opened the keypad, and manually typed in a 12-digit international number. A number I had sworn on my life I would never call again. It rang twice. A deep, gravelly voice answered on the third ring. You said you were done with me, little sister. Marcus did not sound surprised. He sounded exactly like the nightmare I remembered. I need an extraction, I whispered, keeping my eyes locked on the heavy steel door. They are holding my son hostage at the Grand Palms Hotel tonight. They are using my name to launder federal charity funds. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear the faint click of a lighter. I can lock down that hotel, Marcus finally said, the ice in his voice settling over my skin. But my men need 2 hours to secure the perimeter without triggering a police raid. You have to buy me that time. You have to walk into that gala, smile at the cameras, and plug your evidence into their main server yourself. If you fail to deploy that drive, Marcus added coldly, my men will not intervene, and I will let them take the boy. I do not rescue victims, Poppy. I only back players. The line went dead. I stared at the black screen of my phone. The price of his protection was walking straight into the lion's den. I had to become the perfect, obedient wife one last time. I slipped the flash drive deep into the lining of my coat. I turned toward the small side window of the storage room, grabbed a heavy cast iron rolling pin, and prepared to shatter the glass. I was going to the gala, but I was not going as a guest. I shattered the frosted glass of the storage room window with a single swing of the heavy iron rolling pin. The freezing night air rushed in immediately, carrying the damp scent of impending rain and city exhaust. I climbed through the jagged wooden frame, ignoring the sharp sting as a shard of glass sliced through the cotton sleeve of my apron. I had exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes before the Charity Gala officially began. I bypassed my own car, knowing Thomas tracked its GPS, and walked 3 dark blocks to our private residence. The massive house was completely dark, abandoned by Thomas and Eleanor as they prepared for their grand performance at the hotel. I slipped through the back patio door, moving silently across the cold hardwood floors toward Thomas's private home office. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard of his secondary desktop with practiced, rhythmic precision. I plugged my hidden flash drive into the USB port, watching the blue progress bar as thousands of raw ingredient receipts transferred over. I dragged the cursor across 5 years of daily expenditures. $300 for organic vanilla bean, $700 for 50 bags of unbleached flour, $900 for specialized baking equipment. The honest, grueling math of my daily life compiled into a single, undeniable digital file. But I needed their forged ledgers to prove the discrepancy. I bypassed Thomas's basic user profile and accessed the charity's shared domestic network folder. I pulled up 5 years of federal tax filings, matching my exact receipts against their massive, inflated claims. I opened the final quarter's vendor contract, fully expecting to see Eleanor's ornate, sweeping handwriting authorizing the massive overcharges. Instead, a cold, sharp wave of absolute clarity washed over me. At the bottom of every single fraudulent invoice, right next to the exorbitant $50,000 totals, was my digital signature. They hadn't just used my bakery as a convenient front. They had systematically designated me as the sole financial guarantor for the entire operation. If the federal authorities ever audited the charity, Eleanor and Thomas would walk away completely clean as innocent, unknowing board members. I was the designated fall guy. I was the uneducated baker they could seamlessly throw into a federal prison to protect their saintly, untouchable empire. I did not waste a single second feeling sorry for myself. I opened the charity's master compliance dashboard, navigating straight to the Federal Oversight tab. I knew exactly how this accounting software functioned. The IRS automated matching system was already deeply integrated into their domestic server. It only required a single click to bypass their firewall and transmit my real receipts directly to the federal agents Marcus had waiting outside. Once the transfer completed, the DOJ would have the probable cause they needed to execute their warrant and freeze the accounts. It was a perfect, self-executing trap. All I had to do was upload my compiled drive and hit enter. I clicked the upload icon with a steady hand. The screen blinked twice before a flashing red banner erupted across the monitor. Access denied. Master administrator key reset. Eleanor had changed the primary administrative password earlier that morning. My hands gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. The local server was entirely locked down, making my flash drive useless here. There was only one computer left in their entire network that temporarily bypassed this security firewall. The main presentation laptop, currently sitting on the illuminated podium in the center of the Grand Palms Hotel ballroom, was pre-authenticated for the night's live charity auction. I could not trigger the federal freeze from the safety of this empty house. I had to plug the drive directly into their stage computer, right in front of 400 elite guests. I pulled the drive from the port and walked upstairs to the master bedroom. I stripped off my flour-stained apron and stepped into the suffocating, tight-fitting silk dress Eleanor had chosen for me. I slid the cold metal flash drive deep into the hidden seam of my evening clutch. I walked out to the street and hailed a cab, giving the driver the address of the Grand Palms Hotel. Through the taxi window, I could see the massive searchlight sweeping across the hotel's grand entrance. Thomas would be standing right at those front doors, waiting to parade his obedient, terrified wife in front of the cameras. I touched the cold brass key in my pocket. How was I going to get past his suffocating surveillance and reach that stage podium? The taxi pulled up to the glittering entrance of the Grand Palms Hotel, where crystal chandeliers cast long, sharp shadows across the red carpet. Thomas was waiting near the valet stand, his hand resting heavily on the shoulder of my 3-year-old son, who looked impossibly small in his miniature black tuxedo. I stepped out of the car, forcing my spine completely straight, letting the freezing night air numb the frantic beating of my heart. Thomas immediately grabbed my arm, his fingers digging brutally into my bicep beneath the thin silk sleeve of my dress. He smiled for a passing society photographer, a flawless picture of domestic bliss, while whispering through his teeth that I was cutting it entirely too close. The grand ballroom was a suffocating sea of heavy velvet drapes, towering floral centerpieces, and 400 of the city's most elite donors drinking expensive champagne. At the very front of the room stood the illuminated oak podium, holding the master presentation laptop that controlled the charity's entire network. I told Thomas the white hydrangeas on the main stage looked completely lopsided, a trivial domestic complaint that perfectly fit his low opinion of my intellect. He rolled his eyes in disgust and waved me off, ordering me to fix it quickly before the opening remarks began. I walked up the carpeted side steps, my hand clutching the hidden flash drive inside my evening bag, my eyes locked on the glowing screen of the laptop. I was less than 5 feet away from ending their entire fraudulent empire. Before my fingers could even graze the keyboard, harsh whispers echoing from behind the heavy velvet stage curtains stopped me completely dead. Eleanor was standing in the shadows, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing violently into Thomas's chest, her saintly public smile entirely gone. "You are an incompetent fool, Thomas, and if this federal audit exposes one single discrepancy tonight, you will be the one facing the judge," she hissed venomously. "I built this charity from nothing, and I will absolutely not let your sloppy accounting ruin my legacy." Thomas shrank back, his arrogant posture crumbling instantly under his mother's vicious, unyielding dominance. There was no actual loyalty in this supposedly holy family, only a desperate, cannibalistic scramble for survival when the walls started closing in. I took a slow, calculated breath and stepped toward the podium again. slipping the cold metal drive from the lining of my clutch. Suddenly, Thomas marched out from the curtains, his face pale and furious from his mother's berating, and snatched my son directly from my side. Two massive security guards, men on the charity's private payroll who usually guarded the donation vault, immediately flanked him. "Take the boy up to the VIP suite on the mezzanine and lock the heavy doors," Thomas ordered, his voice dripping with unrestrained malice. "He does not leave that room, and if my wife tries to leave this ballroom floor before the auction ends, you handle it." The guards nodded silently, lifting my terrified, crying child and carrying him rapidly toward the private security elevators. My lungs seized, refusing to pull in oxygen as the heavy metal elevator doors slid shut, severing me from the only thing I loved in this world. I was physically trapped on the ballroom floor, surrounded by 400 smiling strangers, unable to run and unable to trigger the federal freeze without abandoning my son to monsters. I stared at the closed elevator doors, the heavy brass storage key burning a hole in my pocket, realizing my child was now completely at the mercy of their hired thugs. But as I backed blindly away from the stage, my elbow bumped hard into a tall waiter carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes. He did not apologize, nor did he flinch or look away. His eyes were dead and cold, scanning the perimeter of the room with strict military precision. Underneath his crisp white catering vest, I saw the faint, unmistakable bulge of a heavy shoulder holster. I looked closer at the staff lining the velvet walls, noticing their rigid posture, the identical clear earpieces, and the cold, unblinking stares fixed directly on the charity's security team. Marcus had not just sent a single bodyguard to watch my back. He had quietly replaced half the event staff with his own syndicate soldiers. The heavy mahogany doors to the grand ballroom remained wide open, welcoming the very last of the wealthy, unsuspecting donors. But as the grandfather clock inched closer to the opening speech, a chilling question hung heavily in the air. When the music stopped, who would really control this room? The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed, casting a theatrical spotlight directly onto the main stage. Eleanor glided toward the mahogany podium in a sweeping emerald gown, looking every bit the benevolent matriarch she pretended to be. I stood frozen near the edge of the carpet, my hands clenched so tightly my fingernails dug half-moons into my palms. For years, I had walked on eggshells, swallowing my pride just to keep the peace. But narcissists do not respect boundaries. They only respect consequences. My child was currently locked in a room 3 floors above us, guarded by men who were paid to be entirely devoid of a conscience. I needed a sign, a signal, anything to tell me that calling my brother had not been the biggest mistake of my life. A tall waiter with cold eyes brushed past my shoulder. He did not stop, but a folded linen napkin slipped from his silver tray and landed precisely at my feet. I knelt down to retrieve it, and as I straightened up, he murmured 3 barely audible words without moving his lips. "The boy is secure." My lungs finally pulled in a full breath of air, realizing Marcus's men had already swept the VIP suite in complete silence. Thomas's hired thugs were likely unconscious in a service closet, and my son was safe in the arms of a syndicate ghost. The massive, suffocating weight that had crushed my lungs for 5 years instantly vanished. I was no longer a hostage. On the stage, Eleanor tapped the microphone, her saccharine voice echoing across the silent ballroom. She spoke endlessly about sacrifice, about the deep moral obligations of family, and about the holy work their charity performed for the less fortunate. I watched the elite donors nod along, completely mesmerized by the flawless, rehearsed empathy of a woman who had just threatened a 3-year-old child. It is a terrifying thing to realize that the most dangerous predators do not hide in dark alleys. They host charity galas and wear custom gowns. And tonight, to ensure the future of this beautiful legacy, my son Thomas and I are taking permanent legal guardianship of my beloved grandson, she announced brightly. She raised her glass, preparing to publicly seal my absolute destruction under the guise of grandmotherly love. She never got to take a sip. A deafening, mechanical clack echoed from the back of the ballroom as the massive oak double doors simultaneously slammed shut. The heavy brass deadbolts rotated, sealing 400 people inside a soundproof vault. The charity's private security guards reached for their radios, but they were already completely surrounded. In perfect unison, 30 catering waiters unbuttoned their crisp white vests, revealing dark tactical gear, and quietly disarmed Thomas's men in less than 10 seconds. There was no shouting, no panic, just the terrifying precision of a hostile takeover executing in plain sight. Eleanor's saintly smile froze instantly on her face. The room now belonged entirely to the monsters she thought she was too important to fear. Marcus stepped out from the shadows near the grand staircase, his custom suit blending perfectly with the darkness. He walked straight toward me, ignoring the bewildered murmurs of the wealthy guests who thought this sudden lockdown was just a dramatic part of the auction. "My men own the building," he whispered, standing close enough that I could smell the cold ozone on his jacket. "But the Federal Cyber Unit requires a mandatory 3-minute delay to ping the network data without flagging it as physical coercion." He looked up at the stage, where Eleanor was glaring down at us with barely concealed fury. "If my men draw a weapon or touch her before that transfer completes, a judge will throw out your evidence. You have 3 minutes to stand there and hold the line." I touched the brass storage key in my pocket, feeling the cold, hard edges of the reality I had chosen. Eleanor was descending the stage steps, her eyes fixed unblinkingly on me, ready to verbally tear me apart for ruining her pristine event. I did not back away, nor did I lower my gaze. I had survived 5 years in her saintly prison. I could survive 3 minutes in a cage with her. But as I took the flash drive out of my evening bag, the final question hung heavily over the silent ballroom. How would the absolute truth hit her when there was nowhere left to run? Eleanor marched down the stairs, her eyes blazing with narcissistic rage. "Who do you think you are? You are a baker, a nobody I pulled from the gutter," she hissed, threatening that I would never see my son again. She was entirely oblivious that her leverage was already gone. I watched the clock tick down the final seconds of the Federal Cyber Unit's mandatory delay. "The boy is gone, Eleanor," I whispered. "He is safe, and you are out of time." I stepped up to the illuminated oak podium. When Thomas lunged at me, 2 of Marcus's men in catering vests pinned his arms. I inserted my flash drive into the master laptop and clicked, "Submit discrepancy." The massive projection screen flickered to life, broadcasting my raw, flour-dusted thermal receipts directly beside their forged tax filings. A $300 vanilla order sat next to a $50,000 claim, both bearing my forged signature. 400 elite donors stared at the undeniable proof of a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation before a blinding red banner erupted: "Immediate federal asset freeze." The mahogany doors swung open as federal agents stepped into the ballroom. Eleanor's saintly smile warped into a mask of terror. She stumbled backward, catching her heel on a cable and hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Thomas dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around his head like a frightened child. As the lead agent read the charges of wire fraud and embezzlement, their holy alliance evaporated. Eleanor twisted in her handcuffs, shrieking that Thomas had orchestrated the entire bakery scheme. Thomas shot up, screaming that his mother approved every transfer and hoarded millions in untraceable gold bars under her floorboards. The pristine family viciously tore each other to pieces to save themselves. I watched them turn into animals, feeling nothing. Marcus nodded toward the exit. I turned my back on the stage, leaving them to drown in their toxic venom, and walked out flanked by syndicate soldiers. We did not go back to the bakery. That life was buried under indictments. Marcus's men drove us to a private penthouse on the 42nd floor. The air didn't smell like warm vanilla, it smelled like leather, ozone, and cold steel. My exhausted son fell asleep on the sofa, finally safe. No one would ever threaten me with his absence again, but the silence was heavy. In the past, anxiety sent me to the kitchen to find comfort in baking. Tonight, I stood in front of the reinforced door and threw 3 heavy steel deadbolts into place. Solid, impenetrable, walking back to the island. I stared at the security monitors. I pulled out the old brass storage key that had turned my sanctuary into a cell and set it on the cold marble next to the glowing red light of the surveillance feed. I did not shed a tear for the woman I used to be. I just rested my hand on the counter, eyes locked on the screens. I traded a saintly prison for a sinner's protection, only to learn that the safest cages are built by those who never pretend to be good.